There is a moment in the story of Hercules that the ancient Greeks returned to again and again. Not the moment he slew the Nemean lion, not the moment he held the weight of the sky above his shoulders, not the moment fire took him on the mountain and something divine rose from the ash. The moment they returned to was quieter and far more terrible. A man stands in a room that was, moments ago, his home, the house of Hercules in Thebes. Walls he knew, floors he had walked 1,000 mornings, the ordinary architecture of a life built with his own hands. He is the strongest being who has ever walked the earth. He carries the blood of Zeus in his veins and the bearing of a hero in every line of his body. And he is standing in a silence so complete it has its own weight, looking at what his hands have done. The madness has lifted, the divine delusion sent by Hera, queen of Olympus, goddess of marriage, his enemy since before he drew his first breath, has dissolved like smoke. And in the clarity that remains, Hercules understands with perfect and unsparing precision what happened here. His children are dead, killed by the hands that strangled serpents in a cradle, the hands that drew a bow no mortal could draw, the hands the gods themselves had armed. This is not where the story of Hercules ends. It is where it truly begins. We know him by his Roman name, Hercules, but the Greeks called him Heracles, and that name carried a terrible irony woven into the very syllables of it that will become clear before this story is finished. To understand how a man arrives at such a moment, you must first understand the world in which he was born, and the war declared against him before he was. The heroic age of Greece was not a time of peace between gods and mortals. It was a time of intimate and dangerous entanglement, a period when the Olympians moved through the world of men with casual, catastrophic freedom, when divine blood ran through the veins of kings, and when the distance between the sacred and the human was not a chasm, but a permeable border crossed by desire, by ambition, and by the particular willingness of Zeus, king of the gods, to take mortal form whenever a woman captured his attention. Zeus had fathered heroes before. Perseus was his son. The blood of the Sky Father ran through half the royal houses of Greece. But Zeus looked at the world he had made, the monsters that still moved through it, the giants and the creatures that threatened the order the Olympians had established. And he saw that something more was needed. Not another king, a champion, a mortal with enough divine blood to face what the gods themselves could not destroy without violating the laws that governed their own power. He chose Alcmene. She was the finest woman of her age, the granddaughter of Perseus himself, a woman of complete moral seriousness and a fidelity to her husband Amphitryon that was, in the world of ancient Greece, genuinely remarkable. On the night of Amphitryon's return from war, Zeus took her husband's form. He commanded the night to last 3 times its natural length, 3 nights compressed into one, so that what was conceived in that darkness would be formed in full. Alcmene believed she lay with her husband. She had no reason to think otherwise. But Hera knew. The queen of Olympus always knew. Her husband's infidelities were the constant condition of her divine existence, a humiliation so regular it had become a form of governance, the eternal wound at the heart of the heavenly marriage. Hera's rage at Zeus was ancient and unresolvable. What she could reach was the child, and so she reached for the child. Zeus, exultant, made a proclamation before the assembled gods. The next child born of Perseus's royal line would rule. King of men, holding dominion over all who came from that blood. He was thinking of his son. He meant Hercules. Hera moved faster. She dispatched Eileithyia, goddess of childbirth, to sit cross-legged before the chamber of Alcmene and bind the birth with divine obstruction. And while Alcmene labored and could not deliver, Hera turned her attention to the household of Sthenelus, another descendant of Perseus, whose wife was herself heavy with child. That birth she accelerated. A boy named Eurystheus entered the world first, premature, frightened, small. Zeus's proclamation fell on the wrong head. Eurystheus became king of Tiryns. Hercules was born days late, the divine promise around him already turned into a world where the man he should have ruled already sat on the throne that should have been his. He came into the world with extraordinary size and a quality of stillness that unsettled everyone who witnessed it. But Hera was not finished. On a night when Hercules was still an infant in his cradle, his twin brother Iphicles sleeping beside him, two serpents came. They moved through the darkness of the house with the unhurried certainty of divine commission, sliding over the edge of the cradle in the silence before dawn. Iphicles woke and screamed. The sound brought every adult in the house running, amphitryon, servants, guards with torches. And what they found, when the light resolved the room into focus, was Iphicles pressed rigid against the far end of the cradle in pure terror. And Hercules. Hercules sat at the other end of the cradle, completely calm, holding one dead serpent in each fist. He had strangled them both in the dark. He looked up at the adults gathered around him with the particular serenity of someone who has resolved a minor inconvenience. Amphitryon summoned the blind seer Tiresias of Thebes. The old prophet stood in the room where the dead serpents lay and spoke what he saw in the clarity available only to those whose eyes face inward. He spoke of trials beyond imagining, of monsters that would fall to these hands, of impossible tasks imposed by petty authority, of suffering vast enough to have destroyed any lesser being. And then he spoke of what waited at the end of it all. The gods do not burden those they do not also intend to honor. What endures this much, Tiresias said, will be made immortal. Hercules grew. He grew in ways that exceeded all ordinary measurement. The greatest teachers of the heroic age brought to instruct him. Autolycus taught him wrestling. Castor taught him the arts of war. Eurytus, some traditions tell, taught him the bow, and the bow became his instrument the way a sword becomes an extension of a swordsman. Not a tool, but an expression of what he was. And Linus taught him music. Linus was a musician of such reputation that the Greeks named a form of lamentation after him, the mourning song, sung at the death of a young man before his time. He taught Hercules the lyre. He was, by all accounts, a patient teacher assigned an impatient student. One afternoon, in a frustration any teacher might have felt, Linus struck Hercules. A sharp correction, the kind that stings more than it hurts. Hercules struck back with the lyre. Linus died instantly. Hercules stood over what he had done with the same stillness he had shown in the cradle, not unmoved, but not broken. The moral arithmetic of the heroic world gave him cover. A free man struck may strike back. He was not wrong. But what the lyre had delivered was not a blow proportionate to an insult. It was the full force of a being who existed entirely outside the scale of ordinary human consequence. There is a dark logic to this that the Greeks understood implicitly. If you are raising what amounts to a force of nature and you attempt to correct it with a music lesson, the outcome says less about the pupil than about the fundamental impossibility of the situation. Linus was not the last person to discover that the ordinary tools of civilization, patience, instruction, the sharp word of a teacher, simply do not scale to a being like Hercules. The world would spend the rest of his life learning the same lesson in increasingly spectacular ways. Amphitryon, understanding what he had produced, sent his son to tend cattle on the slopes of Mount Cithaeron. Space, distance, somewhere for the energy to go. A lion had been taking cattle from the herds of Amphitryon and his neighbor, King Thespius. Hercules killed it. He wore its pelt afterward, a precursor, as it would prove, to the far more famous mantle he would one day claim. Thespius, an old king watching history walk across his mountain, made his own calculation. He had 50 daughters. He wanted the blood of the greatest hero in the world running in the veins of his grandchildren. Over 50 nights, he gave Hercules one daughter for each. The sources agree on the arithmetic. Thespius got his wish. But the deed that carried Hercules from the mountain into history was the liberation of Thebes. The city had been bound for years to the minions of Orchomenus, paying an annual tribute so deliberately humiliating that it had become a wound in the civic soul of Thebes. When the minions' ambassadors arrived to collect, Hercules met them on the road. He cut off their ears and their noses, strung the pieces around their necks, and told them to carry these back as this year's tribute from Thebes. War followed. Hercules armed the Thebans with weapons stripped from temple walls, ancient offerings gathering dust because no one had expected to need them. He led the city into battle with a tactical intelligence that matched his physical power, drove the minions back to Orchomenus, and returned Thebes to itself completely. King Creon of Thebes gave him his daughter Megara. Hold this moment. The story will not give you many like it. Megara was not a diplomatic arrangement. She was his wife, and he was her husband, and the house they made in Thebes held warmth in it. 3 sons. Some ancient sources say more. Children who looked up at a father who was the strongest man alive and saw only that he was theirs. Hercules, born into conspiracy, who had killed before he could walk, whose every teacher had measured the impossible distance between what he was and what the world could safely contain, had built something ordinary. It looked, for a time, like it might be enough. Hera had been patient. She had watched Hercules survive the serpents and survive Linus and wear the lion's skin and liberate a city and stand at an altar beside Megara. She had watched him become everything Zeus had promised. And her patience became something else. She sent Lyssa, the goddess of madness, of frenzy, the divine force that inhabits the mind and bends it until what is beloved becomes unrecognizable. Lyssa came into Hercules the way a storm enters a clear day, sudden, total, and absolute. The playwright Euripides recorded the terror of this madness with a precision that has not been surpassed in 2,500 years. The children died, killed by their father in the grip of a delusion so complete that his own sons did not appear to him as his sons. The faces of enemies overlaid on the faces of everything he loved. He could not find them inside the madness. Hera made certain of it. Let the deaths stand as stated. The weight of this moment does not live in the act. It lives in what came after. In the silence when the delusion dissolved, when Hercules stood in his own home and understood with complete and devastating clarity exactly what his hands had done. He went to Delphi. There is no other move available to a man at such a point. The oracle of Apollo, the one institution in Greece that could reach into the will of the gods and return with an answer, was the only place where what had happened might be given a shape that could be endured. He presented himself at the sanctuary. He stated what he had done without evasion. He asked what was required. The oracle spoke. Go to Tiryns. Place yourself in the service of Eurystheus. Perform whatever labors he assigns without refusal for 12 years. At the end of them, completion, purification, the possibility of something no mortal has yet been offered. Consider the full weight of this sentence. Eurystheus, king by the manipulation of Hercules' birth, the direct beneficiary of Hera's interference at the moment Zeus made his proclamation, was now the authority whose commands Hercules must follow without question for 12 years. The man wronged before he was born must serve the instrument of that wrong as the price of atonement. Some ancient traditions hold that it is at this moment, at the threshold of servitude, that the Greek name Heracles acquires its full and terrible meaning, the glory of Hera. The goddess who had arranged every catastrophe in his life would have her name woven permanently into the glory produced by surviving them. In the mythological imagination of ancient Greece, irony at this scale is never accidental. It is architecture. What the ancient Greeks were working through in the story of Hercules, not the simplified version of strength and conquest, but this version, the one that sits with the madness and the sentence, was one of the most serious questions their civilization could articulate. Can a man be held to account for what he did without will? When divine hands move through mortal hands, who carries the consequence? The Greeks gave no clean answer. They gave Hercules instead. A man who did not cause the madness and cannot undo the murders and chooses nevertheless to accept the sentence. Not because he is guilty of what occurred, but because he is the one who remains. Because he is the one who must. There is a form of dignity in this that is entirely distinct from innocence. Hercules does not protest at Delphi. He does not argue divine causation. He asks what must be done and then prepares to do it. The labors are not proof of innocence. They are proof of something rarer and harder. A man who understands that the only honorable response to catastrophic loss, even loss you did not choose, is to rise and carry it forward. The ancient world understood something about this that later centuries have sometimes obscured. That atonement is not the same as punishment. Atonement is the act of continuing, of building something from the wreckage, of choosing every single day to go on. He walked toward Tiryns, carrying everything he had lost: the lion's skin across his shoulders, the bow, the club, the gifts the gods had pressed into his hands, the sword from Hermes, the armor forged by divine craft, the bow that some traditions say came from Apollo himself. Because even the Olympians understood that what they had created needed equipment proportional to what it would face. Athena had guided his hand before and would guide it again. Hera's opposition ran through his entire life and would run through the labors to come. He walked between them as he had always walked, the focal point of forces larger than any single mortal should be asked to contain. Inside Tiryns, Eurystheus waited. A small man in a large chair, made king by divine manipulation at the moment of birth, already afraid, already composing in the corners of his fearful mind the first of the tasks he would assign a man he could not control and did not understand. Already thinking about how to use the 12 years, how to send him far enough away that the city could breathe, how to make each task impossible enough that it might finally mercifully finish what Hera had been trying to finish since before either of them was born. He would find that Hercules was not diminishable in the ways a frightened king imagines. Hercules stood at the gates of Tiryns. The greatest hero in the world, born of divine conspiracy, marked for destruction before his first breath, survivor of serpents and lions and madness and grief, arrived at the threshold of his servitude. Tiresias had spoken over him when he was still small enough to fit in a cradle. What suffers this much, the old prophet had said, will be made immortal. The suffering was not finished. The path to whatever waited at the end of it passed through that gate. He walked through. What Eurystheus had waiting for him was 12 labors no mortal mind had yet conceived as possible. A lion whose skin could not be pierced by any blade forged by man, a creature of 9 heads that multiplied in its own death. And, at the furthest reach of the list, a descent into the underworld itself, into the kingdom of the dead, from which no living man had ever returned carrying what Eurystheus would demand he bring back. Those are the stories that follow, and they begin at Tiryns with a frightened king and the first impossible command. This chapter of this legend has been told. Subscribe and return to Aeonkeep. More legends await.